Hey everyone, Pastor Bob here. We're getting ready for our series called Origins, the book of Genesis, which we're going to be launching here on Sunday, January 5th, 2025. Hard to believe we're already in the year 2025. And this first Sunday of the year, I think, is a great Sunday for us to launch this study in Genesis because we're beginning at the beginning. And we're going to be taking a deep dive into Genesis. And one of the things that as I've been doing study for this series, I realize is that you cannot cover everything in Genesis in a series of sermons. You have about 20 to 25 minutes on a Sunday morning. You can't quite get into everything. In fact, there are scholars who have written volumes and volumes on Genesis. There's no way a regular old preacher like me is going to get into that level of detail on the book of Genesis. But there are some things that I'd like to be able to pass along to help you in your reading of Genesis that may not make it into the sermons, but that are nonetheless really important for our understanding of this book. And the first of these things I want to look at before we even get to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, is the question of who wrote the book of Genesis. It's an important question. Who's the author? Well, traditionally, Moses has been viewed as the author of Genesis. Now, Genesis does not name Moses as its author, doesn't give us a superscription, Moses, wrote this particular text. But the biblical writers assume that the author of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the books of the law, or the books of Moses, was indeed Moses. You see references in the Old Testament to the book of Moses. In fact, I was just reading in my devotions this morning about King Josiah. They're finding the book of Deuteronomy in the temple and reading that to the people, and he calls it the book of Moses. You see Jesus in the New Testament saying Moses commanded certain things. I think about Mark chapter 10, where Jesus is talking about divorce and what Moses allowed versus what Jesus is going to talk about. So you've got a lot of evidence to suggest that people in the ancient world, as well as many people today, see Moses as the primary author. On the other hand, very few of these references in the Bible itself refer back to Genesis and put Moses in there as the author. So that's kind of interesting. Most of the references to the books of Moses have to do with the law, which certainly Moses received on Mount Sinai, not only the 10 Commandments, but the other laws that defined who Israel was. But none of these refer specifically back to Genesis. In fact, there are very few references back to Genesis other than to the Abraham story and forward there in the rest of the Old Testament. Adam, for example, not mentioned hardly at all outside of the book of Genesis. So that leads us to believe that somewhere along the line, there might be some other ideas about who might have added to this. And there's some reasons for that. For example, there are some passages in Genesis that don't fit the timeline for Moses to have been the author. Genesis 11:28, for example, references Ur of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were an Aramaic-speaking tribe that lived in the first millennium BC, long after the time of Moses. And in fact, Chaldeans is a term used in the Bible often to talk about the Babylonians, which is a much later empire. Babylon, of course, being modern-day Iraq, that area in Mesopotamia, much later reference than the time of Moses. And then you have Genesis 14:14, which talks about the city of Dan, which was not named the city of Dan until the time of the Judges, after the time of the conquest of the Canaanites, much later than the time of Moses. Of course, it's named after Jacob's son, Abraham's great-grandson, but it wasn't named that until after the time of Moses. So it seems like there's been some editing that's gone on with the book of Genesis. And in fact, scholars have looked at Genesis and its linguistic style, and over the course of the last couple of centuries, actually since the 19th century, they've been looking at the different sources that may have contributed to the writing of Genesis. And they use this idea called the four-source theory because God is called different names in Genesis in different places, and there are other materials that seem to be added to Genesis that don't quite fit the same literary genre or style of writing. So the four-source theory goes something like this. There was a Yahwist source that refers to God as Yahweh. Of course, God's name cannot be spoken, so Yahweh is kind of a pseudonymic for God, but they call that the J source in this understanding. And then there's another reference to God called Elohim, which is abbreviated as E in this theory. There's a Deuteronomist source, which is a source about the law, primarily the book of Deuteronomy, called D, and then a priestly source, which is abbreviated P, which talks a lot about priestly material. Let's dive into this a little bit, because I think this is an important theory for us to at least touch on. J, E, and P are the three that would affect Genesis as we read it. So if we look at Genesis as a document, possibly redacted over time, the J source, the Yahweh source, is translated in English often as Lord. And the assumption is that this is a reference that comes from the time of the southern kingdom of Judah in the 10th century BC. Why do we say that? Well, the natives of Palestine are called Canaanites at that point. There's references in Genesis to the Canaanites. God is anthropomorphized. He takes on human characteristics. He walks with Adam and Eve in the garden. And on the other hand, the references around Elohim, which in our English Bible is translated Lord God, may be connected to the northern kingdom of Israel in the 9th century BC. Remember, after the time of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel splits into two parts, the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. Both of them are going to be taken over by foreign powers, but they have distinct traditions. The Elohist emphasizes prophecy. God speaks in dreams. We see the dreams of Jacob, for example. We see the dreams of Joseph. So these look like a couple of different kinds of materials. We see that most clearly in Genesis 1 and 2, where you have two different accounts of creation right there back to back. Now we try to synthesize them, but they very likely came from two different sources, and it's important for us to think about that. And then there's a third source called the priestly source, which may have been developed after the exile as late as the 6th century BC, where we might have seen the final revision of Genesis. The theology of the priestly source is that of Jewish religious identity, which is found in proper worship and in special laws. Think about the creation story, for example, in Genesis 1. What's that about? It's primarily a focus on Sabbath, as we're going to see when we get into the second sermon in this series. We see circumcision, the origin of circumcision, as a marker of Jewish identity there in the story of Abraham. There's a lot of emphasis on the temple cult and proper worship. I'm going to argue, as many Old Testament scholars argue, that Genesis 1 is actually a temple building text. We'll get into that more the following week on January 12th. But the emphasis in this source is on order and majesty in God's creation. So it seems like we have a lot of different sources that are contributing to Genesis. The bottom line is, who wrote it? We're not certain. We can only theorize based on the evidence. Moses may have been the author. He may have been an author, one of many who contributed to this book over time. Or maybe he didn't write it at all. Maybe he writes other parts of the Pentateuch. We don't know for sure. Genesis may indeed be a document that was not just sat down and written at one time, but rather compiled over the course of some 800 years until it reaches its final form in post-exilic Israel. That's an important thing for us to remember, that we've got a lot of different sources here, and we're not sure of that question. Does that, however, mean that Genesis is not divinely inspired? Absolutely not. Why is Genesis written? Well, I think there are a number of reasons why it's written. First, it's written to establish the character of Israel's God as one, as holy and transcendent, as the singular creator and the one true God in the midst of a world that believed in many gods. We'll talk about this more when we get into the creation story itself and how in many ways, the creation narrative pokes back against the creation narratives of people like the Babylonians or the Egyptians there in the ancient Near East. So Genesis is written to establish the origins of Israel's identity and their core practices, which were essential to a people dominated by their pagan neighbors. Now, if you were writing in the exile, remember that people are taken away from the kingdom of Judah, taken to Babylon. The Babylonians try to make them into Babylonians, but they're trying to hold on to their identity. I mean, read the book of Daniel, that's what that's really about. And so perhaps as late as the post-exilic period, these writers are adding material to Genesis to establish their identity as a people. This is our origin story. It goes back to Abraham, and here are these core practices and where they came from, right from the very beginning. But Genesis is also written to establish the covenantal line of Israel's patriarchs and to tell the story of the family that would become the nation of Israel. That origin story is very important. Abraham becomes the father of many nations. He's kind of in many ways the central figure of Genesis. It's from him that God is going to launch this rescue plan for the world. I say central figure, I mean the central human figure. I'm going to argue that the real central figure of Genesis is God himself. This is where we learn about God's character and so forth. The point is that if Genesis is compiled over a long timeline, its strength then stems from the idea that this is a foundational story to which the whole Bible is going to continue to refer back to over and over again. It's an important enough story that it gets that connectivity throughout the Bible. It's referred back to over and over again, particularly the first 3 chapters, particularly into the story of Moses. So as you're reading Genesis, you might see these different kinds of styles that appear there in your reading. Watch for them. You might see them. Of course, if you believe that Moses wrote every word, no one's going to tell you that you're wrong. We just don't know for sure. We just take a look at where the evidence leads us. I think it means that God has divinely inspired either a writer or many writers to bring this story to us because it's foundational. It's the origin story of Israel. It's the origin story of humanity. And it tells us who started it all, and that's the Lord God. Yahweh, Elohim, whatever you call him, we call him God and Creator, the one God who created all. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you back here again for another lesson as we move through this series, Origins, the book of Genesis.